in trying to kick off our discussions. I suppose, thinking back to the last 2 days that we've been talking, one of the things which has made it so intensely enjoyable for me has been that it was our discussions, although about things that I didn't know necessarily a great deal about, have been in a very familiar language, the language of traditional states, traditional international relations. When you start talking about emerging Asia and Europe, you start talking in a different register. And therefore I was thinking, why is that? A few years ago, some of you may have read the book. It's a little book by someone who writes extremely well, but is rather dangerous. I think an opponent of Stephan, an American called Robert Kagan, who wrote a little book, he's written several since, called On Paradise and Power, in which he said Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. It was an extremely irritating remark if you were a European, of course. But it
tell us where he was from.
It sparked off quite a debate about the credibility and the viability of the sustainability of the new Europe. And it led to another little and interesting book by a British diplomat, Robert Cooper, who wrote a book called The Making and Breaking of Nations, which was in many ways sort of used some of Kagan's language, but gave it a new twist. And he talked about the world after the end of the Cold War being divided between pre-modern, modern, and postmodern states. And Europe fell into the postmodern category. And that again makes it much more difficult to talk about. Now, postmodernism is one of those very difficult concepts. It was invented by architects in the first instance, and philosophers and literary people. And if you read what they all say about postmodernism, they say that it's meant to be playful. You can see the playfulness in architecture because they mix up all the styles. But in literature, it meant you never have one ending. You did get rid of the author. You could write from any particular point of view. In social science, far from being playful, it led to the most indigestible, unintelligible prose that I have ever read on anything. So I'm hesitant to use it. But I think what Robert Cooper meant by a postmodern state was one which really relied on what in the new jargon is called soft power, rather than the traditional methods, or example rather than force, to spread its influence around the world. Well, so that's, I just mention that, keep that in the background, because it helps to, I think, explain the difficulties we have of bringing Europe into this discussion on Asia and the rise, or the rise and fall and impact of China. If we start, and I know this won't be accepted right even along this table, but if we start the discussion with the assumption that the political center of gravity in international politics is moving, however slowly, but is still moving eastwards, what role will Europe, and specifically the European Union, play? It was until the mid-20th century that part of the world, not only from where most of the governing ideas came, but which, compared with the successor hegemon to the European empires, the United States, had a much longer and deeper knowledge of Asian affairs and cultures. So other things being equal, it should be in a position, particularly given the size of the European and weight of the European economy in world trade and the overall world economy, it should be in a position of considerable comparative advantage as a strategic partner in an increasingly globalized economy, other things being equal. But of course, other things are not equal. So what is the problem? And I think the difficulty, as I've already hinted with answering this question, is the lack of coherence that characterizes contemporary politics in both Europe and in Asia. The major Asian players, China, India, Japan, but also the second tier, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, are not bad at cooperating, at least some of the time, diplomatically. And I think that is what the record of the Association of South ASEAN of East Asian Nations would suggest. As an old-fashioned diplomatic concert, it is quite effective. But they also have quite sharply conflicting interests and memories of World War II, which make it difficult to contemplate economic integration as a political strategy. And of course, because of an opposite kind of experience in Europe, Europeans have great difficulty in not seeing why the rest of the world doesn't see that they can solve their problems in the way that France and Germany solved their problems. So it's a sort of mirror image of incomprehension, if you like. Most of these states, the Asian states, are both attracted and repelled by China in almost equal measure. This draws them closer to the United States, but even in the case of Japan, it makes their governments flirt with the idea of hedging their bets. I mean, I think it's the one point you can make about Japan, and I don't know whether Philip will agree with me, is that the Japanese throughout their history have been prepared to do whatever they thought was necessary in order to survive as an independent entity. And of course that has meant since 1945 tying themselves very close to the United States and reinforcing the bilateral treaty whenever possible. But there's always a subterranean fear in the Japanese psyche that what the Chinese want and they don't want could happen. The Americans could go away, and then they will need an alternative strategy. So this is what I mean, and if the Japanese is the extreme example of a wider tendency in the region to think you've got to hedge your bets. Some of these and if you look, I think I suggested to Dr. Samir before that the book, which is edited by my friend Krishnan Srinivasan and a Swedish former diplomat, called Europe and Emerging Asia, has many examples of this in the Asian chapters. Some of Emerging Asia would probably like to see Europe act, I mean India certainly would, as a balancing strategic player in Europe, balancing to the United States. But that, of course, A, is unlikely to happen because of the levels of European defense spending, and B, would be extremely unwelcome in Washington, which doesn't actually particularly want anybody else complicating the already very complicated strategic situation any further. And in any case, whether there are people who might dream that way in Europe, short-run imperatives make it very unlikely, it seems to me, at the moment. In any event, the European vision of crafting a new kind of polity, a civilian power, in which economic integration is viewed as a political strategy for resolving conflicts between sovereign states, has little traction in a part of the world where the leading countries are intent on modernizing their already formidable armed forces and armories. Meanwhile, in Europe itself, many people across the Union seem to have forgotten the role that European integration played in stabilizing the continent after the turbulence which repeated Franco-German nationalist rivalry had caused, not merely in Europe, but worldwide. Euroscepticism is no longer a British monopoly, although in the context of Euro-Asian relations, the British problem is particularly inhibiting, as I'll try and say something about a little bit later on. But the EU, unfortunately, does not seem, although it's trying, it doesn't seem to have overcome the somewhat preachy diplomatic style which very often irritates the governments with whom they interact, rather than persuades them to follow the European model. Indeed, I would be tempted to say that the real success of the European Union was a regional success in solving, because they had to, by economic means, a deeply laid political problem. Its failure has been what I saw, this preachy attitude which that generated, in thinking that they'd come up with a kind of universal economistic way of solving the world's problems if only people would follow the European model. And that's where they get themselves into such problems. Let me say a little bit about the first set of constraints which can limit the influence of Europe in Asia. And of course it is the legacies of empire. Europe's entanglement with Asia was initially a result of imperial expansion and proselytizing religion. Both have created an ambiguous legacy for contemporary relations, some of which will have echoes in this part of the world. The European empires that most influenced Asia, the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British, started as straightforward players in the development of long-distance trade, a process in which commercial and strategic considerations were not easily separated. The economic view of the early adventurers was, in modern terms, zero-sum, so that in terms of trying to secure, let me give one example, famous example, monopoly rights over precious commodities, such as nutmeg, which was at that time located in the Banda Islands of the Indonesian archipelago. Both foreign powers and local rulers were willing to take huge military as well as financial risks. If they lost, and they mostly did lose, they lost everything. If they won, if the boats came home, the riches were untold. It was a sort of early version of Dubai, if you like. In many cases, trade did not so much follow the flag as the flag followed religion. And the nature of the impact changed over time. Trade across the Arabian Sea had already led to the establishment of a very strong Muslim presence in South and Southeast Asia, often associated with the exercise of political power, even before the invasions across the Himalaya from Central Asia. When the Portuguese first established themselves in what is now Goa and the Malabar Coast, Kerala, they brought with them a militant form of Catholicism. And this part of the world provides a fascinating contrast between early and late imperial states, European states, and their influence on subsequent political and economic relations. The tropical landscape of the Malabar Coast is dotted with Baroque churches, and the style even invaded the Hindu temples, whose priests managed to escape forced conversion by fleeing inland. Equally, of course, the strength of Hindu society managed to defeat even the militant Catholics. Kerala is one of the very few places where you will find a caste of Catholic Brahmins, which should be a contradiction in terms, but isn't. By the time Britain had emerged, and this is the contrast, as the dominant European power in the region, the emphasis was entirely different. For the most part, British influence is invisible or institutional, to be found in the infrastructure of the modern state, in roads, railways, harbours, botanical gardens, very important aspect, and in the armed services and bureaucracies. But whatever their form, these legacies have a continuing but ambiguous impact on Europe's relations with Asia. On the one hand, they've created a network of economic and social contacts which give the relevant groups in European countries, churches obviously, but chambers of commerce, those with a stake in cultural relations as a form of soft power, diplomacy, and so on. It gives all of these groups an entree into Asian societies. On the other hand, they've left behind minorities whose presence and international links have a capacity to rekindle anti-colonial sentiment and suspicion. An example is the anti-Christian agitation leading to pressure for legislation to forbid conversion and church burnings and so on in some Muslim countries such as Pakistan, but also, and actually at the moment more dominantly, in India. China is different again. Never colonized, but as we have heard over the last 2 days, humiliated and shamed. The ambiguity is brilliantly illustrated by Hong Kong and Macau. I have been, like most of us, to Hong Kong quite often, and even though, despite what we were saying yesterday about whether it has changed, most of my Hong Kong friends who have either are now or have in the past worked in Singapore would claim that Hong Kong, despite everything that is happening, is now still much freer than Singapore. And in my experience, that's true. And it's remarkable. I mean, and of course, it's one of those, it's why the Chinese are so worried. If you buy the Straits Times in Hong Kong, you are not meant to take it into the new territories. But of course, it goes into the new territories and it goes far behind, so that the notion that you can somehow censor the news in the Straits Times once you cross onto the mainland just doesn't hold. Macau is an even more extraordinary experience. As you will know, Macau was Portuguese. It suffered an appalling earthquake, which leaves only the facade of the great cathedral, and in the facade the painting of the martyrs, the Japanese martyrs to Christendom, who were all crucified. It's an extraordinary picture, because if you think of how crazy human beings can be, you have a religion which is running wildfire through Japan, and then it is expelled. But of course there are a whole lot of converts who are now a political threat to the regime and administration. And how do you, it becomes very important to the Japanese, we're talking the 17th century now, it becomes very important for them to, that they should recant. There's 23 of them don't recant. They're tortured and they still don't recant. So what happens? They are crucified. So you use the basic symbol of the religion to as it were, attack the religion itself. It is a very strange psychological twist. But Macau, anyway, Macau is there. It was taken over, like Hong Kong, by the Chinese government, which of course has had a long-standing problem with Chinese society's addiction to gambling. Chinese will gamble on absolutely anything. So they are actually forbidden from gambling on anything except in Macau. Macau is now a sort of Las Vegas kind of enclave stuck on the edge of South China. If you go there at the weekend, which is when people can get in, I'd driven from old Canton Guangzhou up to, and they left me at the edge of the queue, which was about 2 miles from the crossing point, and it took a very long time to get in. People go in huge numbers. The turnover from gambling in Macau is now so great that the Macau government gives a handout to all Macau citizens of $10,000 US twice a year. It's a fairly dramatic illustration of, as it were, the ambiguous legacies of the impact of Europe. But perhaps the most complicated aspect of the legacy concerns the concept of Europe itself. The idea of Pan-Asianism flowered briefly after 1945, but it never succeeded in generating real political traction. Countries that had only recently secured their sovereignty, either directly from a European power, and had sometimes also experienced a period of Japanese military rule in the run-up to independence, were unsurprisingly reluctant to surrender the prize. In recent years, there has been a proliferation of Asian multilateral institutions, many led by China, but they are all intergovernmental. They are not integrative. They're not, as in Europe, They don't raise this question of a sort of enfilading, sideways attack on sovereignty by the merging of economic sectors. Moreover, the nature of the European Union, neither fish nor fowl, neither a state nor a normal intergovernmental organization, baffles many Asians who have to do business with it. They generally prefer bilateral relations, a preference which is reinforced also by the fact that the major European states, EU states, Germany, France, Britain, possibly Italy, are reluctant to cede control over detailed commercial and financial relations with Asian countries, cede control to Brussels. They have, of course, it was the first thing they did, they have ceded control over macro trade policy, as it were. The common commercial policy was the first aspect of integration in the European Union. But when it comes to specific contracts, the big players want to keep their bilateral relations and their advantages they gain from them to themselves. The European Union now has a Commissioner for External Relations, effectively a foreign minister, and it has a diplomatic service of its own. And this does good work, trying to familiarize Asia with the EU and to open up investment and business opportunities for Europeans in Asian countries. One of the things, rather sad things really, that happened in Asian-European relations with the expansion of the EU after the Cold War was that the very close ties which many East European countries had developed with Asian countries during the Cold War began to wither on the vine as there's a very interesting chapter on Poland in this respect in our book. As the magnetic attraction of membership of the European Union replaced these earlier instances. So they've almost got to start again. And the EU External Relations Service is doing good work in, as I say, opening up investment and business opportunities for New Europe in Asian countries. But inevitably it's the newer and smaller members that are most enthusiastic about these efforts. So for many Asian governments, the diplomatic efforts of the EU in their capitals smacks, the phrase that I've written down may not be familiar in this part of the world, I've said smacks of the tail wagging the dog. I don't know whether you have a UAE equivalent. Does the tail of the camel wag the camel? I don't know what.
The dog. The camel doesn't wag.
It doesn't wag its tail. So
but
we'll have.
We use the same.
You do. So we stick with the dog. Yeah. Right. So that's one set of constraints which hedge around this European problem. The other, I think, is the legacies of the Cold War. From most Asian perspectives, the European Union is itself a legacy of the Cold War. Part of the security architecture erected by the West, primarily, of course, by the United States, to contain the Soviet Union and China. This is not the whole story, but it is certainly the case that solving the problem of West Europe's historic enmities made strategic sense from both a European and a broader Western point of view. Much of Asia, on the other hand, wanted to engage with the Central Power struggle as little as possible, unless it happened to impinge on their own local security interests, as I suggested when I was talking about India with Pakistan. The result was that the EU was not central to their concerns in 1989-91 as it was to East European countries and even to Turkey, for whom membership at that time, no longer, but at that time, was an important foreign policy objective. Moreover, there was considerable suspicion of the liberal international order that the US and the EU here just as strongly, if not more strongly than the US, wanted to put in place a scheme based on human rights, democratic government, and humanitarian intervention. One reason, and I think I mentioned this, but I'll repeat myself, one reason the support operation for the Iraqi Kurds was not referred back to the Security Council after the first Gulf War was the suspicion that humanitarianism was being used as a substitute for this political agenda and that the resolution would be vetoed. And as I did say, I know 2 days ago, the major review conference in the 1990s on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was used by Singapore, China, and India in particular to launch a counterattack in the name of Asian values. Colonialism, combined with the view of the EEC, or the EU as it now is, as a Cold War institution, has constrained the development of European relations with Asia in another way. The European Commission has always wanted to paint a portrait of itself and of Europe as outward-looking, dynamic, and progressive. But this has always been a hard task. Viewed from outside Europe, the EU has often seemed inward-looking, protectionist, and parochial. As the phrase goes, the fears always outside Europe looking in are of a fortress Europe. At the outset, that's to say before the original Treaty of Rome in 1957, France made its membership dependent on the original members, the other five as it then was, because Britain wouldn't of course join, sharing the cost of subsidizing France's remaining colonies, mainly in Africa and the Caribbean. This arrangement, it was this arrangement which led eventually to the formation of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific, the ACP grouping, and its successive conventions. Now, this is no longer a factor, but it's a legacy. It was not, at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Rome, consistent with existing rules under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But largely under American pressure, it was got through as a necessary price to pay to give the West a semblance of strategic and institutional coherence. The Americans at all points, and this was something the British alone, despite the so-called special relationship, were the only people not to understand. The Americans at all points wanted a strong EU. Well, they didn't want an EU, they wanted a strong EEC, and they wanted it as the strong second pillar to the Atlantic arch, strategic arch. And they were certainly prepared to pay the price of special, technically illegal subsidy arrangements for the grossly uneconomic commodities sold into Europe from France's former colonies. Now, breaking the rules in this way had little to offer the larger Asian countries, which, although former colonies and mostly poor, were considered too large to fit into what was seen by many as a neo-colonial scheme. They were left to make their own bilateral agreements with the EDC, which they mostly did. This was better than nothing, but for some of the poorest countries like Bangladesh, for example, whose exports of textiles were a major source of income, it represented a real cost. So it's difficult to totally ignore, as in all of these things, the weight of the past on the present structure of relations. Let me say something finally about the British problem in the EU, because I think it does play into the wider discussion in a number of ways. Despite the problems of incomprehension and the ambiguous legacy of the past, there can be no doubt that there's considerable overlap of interests between Europe and Asia. In terms of the rapid growth in their share of world GDP, most of the larger Asian economies are advancing rapidly. Between 2001 and 2011, and therefore I acknowledge, so that we don't need to go there, that this predates the sudden slowdown of the Chinese economy that we've been discussing. But between 2001 and 2011, China increased its share of the world economy by 154%, India by 72%, Indonesia by 142%, whereas most of the major European countries saw their percentages decline. The UK by 24%, Germany by 13%, France by 5%, and Italy by 10%. Yet between them, the two regions still account for 70% of world trade and over 50% of world GDP. And both need each other's markets and investment, while overall Asian scientific research and higher education, I think it's fair to say, continue to lag behind that of the West, giving most major Asian countries, including China, a stake in fostering economic cooperation in research and higher education, as we suggested in an earlier session. It might be thought then, against that background, that the British would be in the best position to overcome the obstacles to enhanced engagement and to act as a key facilitator for its partners, if not act as their leader. In practice, Britain's own problems with Europe make it impossible for it to play this role, at least for the time being. Britain's traditional attitude to Europe was to prevent the rise of a power whose ambitions would draw Britain into European politics at the expense of its worldwide interests. This policy can only be pursued under contemporary conditions, in my view, and I'm not certain that my colleague on the left shares this, but it can only be pursued, in my view, within the European Union. Although significant sections of the political class don't accept this, and this has spread to other European countries. And I think it's just worth making one aside. We tend to, in my view, the reason for European integration was always political. It was, if you like, in Dean Acheson's famous phrase, Britain had lost an empire and now found a role, and hadn't found a role. It had to make a strategic choice for reasons which were to do on the left with the fact that large sections of the British political left thought of Europe as a businessmen's cartel ganging up against the workers, and on the right, large sections of the party faithful in the Conservative Party, who still had roots in the shires, thought that the real answer to Britain's policy was the empire sort of dressed up in as a Commonwealth of independent states. There was a general skepticism right across the political spectrum, not amongst, of course, the political leadership. And as a result of that, when Harold Macmillan decided, after the Suez fiasco, that he would need to take Britain for strategic political reasons into Europe, he had to sell the idea to the British public as a quick economic fix to what was called the British disease at that time, the disease which stemmed from having been the first industrial country and having therefore a lot of old and decaying industries and the social and economic problems that were associated with them. And that problem, I mean, I could go on a lot for that, but it's not relevant to our purpose. So if you want to raise it in the question time, please do. But it's never really gone away. I mean, the baton of Euroscepticism has changed hands from the Labour Party to the Conservatives, and now it's being challenged, of course, by both the Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party and by the United Kingdom Independence Party. But it's always been there, and as I say, it's now in no country is the mix the same, but it's the general nationalistic Euroscepticism is spreading to many other countries, which really has knocked on the head, even if it was there before, any strong belief in Europe in a federal solution. And what we're looking at best is a confederation, and there's quite strong antipathy even to that. The result, I believe, though, of this problem for Britain is that Britain gets the worst of both worlds. It isn't left alone to pursue its worldwide interests, particularly in Asia. And for some Asian countries, the closeness of its relationship with the US rules it out as a supplier of choice. I mean, Britain's trade with India, in which it has these fantastic relations at a human level and right across the spectrum, is pathetic. Belgium last year had a larger trading relationship with India than Britain. Investment is a different story, but it's still not. It may be changing as a result of the new strategic partnership, but it's still very weak. And you can illustrate it, I think I mentioned it before, if you think of the way France has outmaneuvered Britain, not completely, but fairly comprehensively, in meeting the demands that come from India's policy of wanting to diversify the sources of military supply, and was able to take a very high-profile position in India's Republic Day parade a few weeks ago. Finally, a few words about the China problem in relation to Europe. China, of course, is the dominant issue in Asia's relations with the EU, as it is in so many aspects of contemporary world politics. There are some continuing legacy problems from the Cold War period, particularly the arms embargo, which is deeply resented by the Chinese. But in most other respects, there is a certain symmetry between other Asian country attitudes to China and those of the Europeans. In both regions, there is a measure of suspicion about China's long-term ambitions, about some of its claims, particularly the ones we talked about yesterday in the South China Sea, and some of its practices, particularly what many of them see, quite rightly in my view, as China's huge investment in cyber espionage and cyber warfare. Also, there are direct impact from the slowdown of the Chinese economy. I mean, as you will have read, China, Tata, which previously owned the British steel industry, has laid off 3,000 jobs in Britain over the last month at a time of rising unemployment, and the Tata board has blamed that directly on Chinese dumping of cheap steel. Now, whether they will take that to the WTO dispute anti-dumping procedures and the dispute tribunal remains to be seen. At the same time, the majority of countries in both regions are extremely reluctant to abandon their existing policies of commercially driven constructive engagement and to move to a policy of confrontation. And perhaps this shared dilemma, and this is my last point, perhaps this shared dilemma about how to remain friendly to China while standing up to it could establish a platform for deeper political cooperation. There have been conferences, there was one I think last year in Jakarta, between Europe and Asia on strategic cooperation. And the two areas that emerged as, well, piracy, three areas. Piracy was one, where there could be considerable cooperation, but another was on law of the sea and freedom of navigation, and the third was on cyber. And that seems to be that's the one, the trouble is cyber moves so fast, and to most of the political class in most countries. I mean, I'm told by my friends who really understand the cyber world that one of the real problems between Europe and China, and it's actually probably also a problem between America and China, is that whereas the political class in Europe, partly because of age, doesn't really understand cyber. It uses it, but it doesn't understand it. And that's because who are the political class in Europe? They're lawyers, they are trained, possibly if they're not trained in the law, they're trained in social sciences for the most part, whereas traditionally the political class in China have been engineers, and therefore are quicker to grasp these possibilities. So whether there can be some fruitful European, there's not going to be military cooperation, well, there'll be sales, but there won't be strategic cooperation as there is in the pivot to the American pivot that we've discussed. But whether there can be diplomatic cooperation on such issues as freedom of navigation and cyber, we shall wait and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you.